The Netherlands. Beautiful, orderly, peaceful. Or at least that's what it looks like, because there's a side of this country that doesn't show up in any travel guide. A version that only exists in certain corners of the internet. Corners I stumbled into by accident and couldn't easily find my way out of. This is the dark side of the Netherlands internet. A 15-year-old girl sits alone in her bedroom. She picks up a stack of flashcards and a marker. She starts writing, and then she films herself holding them up one by one, in silence. No voice, just words. And what those cards said broke the internet. When most people think of the Netherlands, they think tulips, windmills, maybe Amsterdam on a trip. But the Netherlands also happens to be home to one of the most prolific online predators ever documented. A man who, from behind a screen, destroyed the lives of dozens of young people across multiple countries and whose actions are directly linked to the death of a teenage girl in Canada. His name is Aydin Coban, and this is his story. Let's go back to around 2009. Social media is still kind of new and exciting. Facebook is blowing up. Webcam chat sites are everywhere. Kids are online more than ever before, and a lot of them, especially teenagers, are figuring out this whole new world of connecting with strangers on the internet. And Aydin Coban knew exactly how to take advantage of that. Coban was a Dutch-Turkish man, living in the Netherlands, and by the time investigators started piecing together what he'd been doing, they were genuinely stunned. Because this wasn't just some creep sending weird messages. This was a calculated, methodical operation. He had created over 90 different online identities, different names, different profile pictures, different backstories. Some of them were fake teenage boys. Some were would-be friends. Some were people claiming to be from the same school or neighborhood as his targets. He would pick a victim, study them, figure out who their friends were, what they looked like, where they went to school, and then he'd slide into their life disguised as someone safe, someone relatable, someone their own age. And once he had their trust, that's when things got dark. One of the first things he'd do is get his victims onto a webcam. He was charming, he was flattering, telling girls they were beautiful, stunning, perfect, and eventually, he'd convince them to expose themselves on camera. The moment he had that footage, he owned them. He would take screenshots, save the videos, and then the tone would shift completely. Suddenly, this friend they'd been talking to for weeks or months revealed his real face. He'd threatened to send those images to everyone they knew, their parents, their classmates, their teachers, unless they gave him more videos, more photos, more control. It's called extortion, and Coban had basically turned it into a full-time job. And here's the thing that makes this even more disturbing. He didn't just do this to one person, or 5 people, or 10. Investigators eventually identified over 75 individual victims in multiple countries: the UK, Canada, Norway, the United States, all targeted by this one man, sitting somewhere in the Netherlands, hiding behind a screen and a rotating cast of fake identities. Now let's talk about Amanda Todd, because even if you've never heard the name Aydin Coban before, there's a very good chance you know who Amanda Todd is. Amanda was a girl from British Columbia, Canada. Bright kid. She loved to sing. She spent a lot of time online, like most teenagers did. And at some point around 2009 or 2010, when she was just 12 or 13 years old, she ended up in a video chat with someone who seemed friendly and nice. That person told her she was beautiful, told her she was stunning, kept complimenting her, building her up, and eventually she exposed herself on camera. One screenshot. That's all it took. What followed was years of relentless torment. Coban used that image as a weapon. He created a Facebook page using her topless photo as the profile picture, with a list of her friends and her school listed on the page. He sent that image to her family, to her classmates, to her school. Every time Amanda tried to move on, changed schools, made new friends, tried to rebuild, he would follow. He found her new Facebook, her new friends, and he'd do it all over again. He sent her over 700 messages across at least 4 different platforms. He used 22 different fake accounts just to interact with her. Some were designed to threaten and intimidate. Others were designed to get close to her again, earn her trust again, so he could keep the cycle going. Amanda tried to reach out for help. She posted on Facebook about what was happening to her. She was clearly crying out, and in September 2012, she uploaded that video, the one with the flashcards, describing everything she had been through: the grooming, the photo, the harassment, the bullying, the absolute destruction of her sense of safety and self-worth. The video went viral almost immediately. Millions of people watched it. And 5 weeks later, on October 10th, 2012, Amanda Todd died by suicide. She was 15 years old. Now here's where the story takes a turn that a lot of people don't know about. Canadian police opened an investigation, but the trail kept pointing overseas, to the Netherlands. to a man in a trailer park in a small southern Dutch town called Oosterwijk. In January 2014, Dutch police arrested Aydin Coban, and when they started going through his devices and his online activity, what they found was staggering. This wasn't just about Amanda. There were dozens of victims. The investigation revealed he had been running this operation across multiple countries for years. Here's the part that'll make your jaw drop, though. Facebook actually flagged Coban to Dutch authorities before Amanda died. They had identified him as a suspect in online harassment and exploitation. The police were alerted, and still, Amanda's torment continued until the very end. In 2017, a Dutch court convicted Coban of blackmailing and harassing 39 victims across multiple countries and sentenced him to nearly 11 years in prison, the maximum sentence under Dutch law at the time. And importantly, Amanda's case was not even part of that Dutch trial. He wasn't charged with anything related to her in the Netherlands. So, what happened next? Well, Canada wanted him. There was a years-long legal process to get Coban extradited to British Columbia to stand trial specifically for what he did to Amanda. And in the summer of 2022, that trial finally happened. The evidence was devastating. Prosecutors walked the jury through how Coban had used those 22 different online accounts to stalk and torment a child, how he had sent her explicit threats, how he had followed her across platforms every single time she tried to escape, how he had, as the judge put it, made ruining Amanda's life his expressly stated goal. The jury convicted him on all major counts: extortion, possession, and distribution of child pornography, child luring, and criminal harassment. In October 2022, he was sentenced to 13 years in prison to be served after he finishes his Dutch sentence. Amanda's mom, Amanda Todd, who had sat in that courtroom every single day, walked out and said, "This is the best day since Amanda was born." But here's the part that left a lot of people, including Amanda Todd, absolutely speechless. Because of how Dutch law works, the 13-year Canadian sentence had to be converted to fit the Dutch legal system before Coban could serve it there. And Dutch prosecutors, they argued that the crimes Coban was convicted of in Canada would typically carry about 4 years in a Dutch court. 4 years for what he did to Amanda Todd. So what do we take away from the story of Aydin Coban? A few things, honestly. First, the scale of what one person can do from behind a screen is genuinely terrifying. Over 75 victims, multiple countries, years of abuse, one guy, one laptop, a rotating cast of fake names. That's it. That's all it took. Second, the systems that were supposed to protect these kids failed. Repeatedly, Facebook identified Coban as a threat and passed that information to Dutch authorities before Amanda died. And yet, that's a conversation that still isn't fully resolved. And third, Amanda Todd's story, as painful as it is, changed things. It sparked national conversations about cyberbullying and online exploitation in Canada and beyond. It's part of why sextortion is now taken far more seriously as a crime internationally. It's part of why Coban eventually faced a court in Canada at all. She held up those flashcards, told her story in silence, and somehow her voice became one of the loudest in the room. Now, Aydin Coban operated in the shadows. Fake names, fake profiles, anonymous and invisible. But our next case, it happened in broad daylight, in the middle of Amsterdam, on a busy street caught on camera, and the digital trail that investigators followed afterward. The encrypted messages, the photos sent from burner phones, the coordinated communications of a criminal network is what eventually blew the whole thing wide open. This is the story of Peter de Vries. Imagine you've spent your entire career exposing criminals, murderers, kidnappers, drug lords. You've won an Emmy. You're the most famous crime reporter in your country. You've been threatened before, plenty of times, and you've never backed down once. And then one evening, you walk out of a TV studio, and someone is waiting for you. Peter R. de Vries was, by any measure, a legend in the Netherlands. If you were Dutch and something terrible happened to you, if your kid went missing, if you were wrongfully convicted, if a killer was walking free and the police weren't doing anything, Peter de Vries was the guy you called. He had spent decades on Dutch television covering the country's most notorious criminal cases. He helped crack cold cases. He exposed corruption. He was relentless. Internationally, he became known in 2008 when he won a Primetime Emmy for his investigation into the disappearance of Natalie Holloway, the American teenager who vanished in Aruba. He was, genuinely, one of the most respected journalists in Europe. And in 2020, he agreed to do something that would ultimately cost him his life. To understand what happened to de Vries, you need to know a little bit about the macro mafia. That's the name Dutch police gave to a Dutch-Moroccan criminal organization that had been operating in the Netherlands and Belgium for years. And at the top of that organization was a man named Ridouan Taghi, described by law enforcement as the country's most wanted criminal, a cocaine empire, a ruthless network, and a guy who, according to prosecutors, had no problem ordering murders when someone got in his way. By the late 2000s and 10s, Dutch authorities were building a massive case against Taghi and his organization, and the key to that case was a man we'll call Nabil B., a former member of the gang who had decided to cooperate with prosecutors and testify against Taghi, a Crown witness. The kind of person who, if the case went well, could put Taghi away for life. Now, being a Crown witness against someone like Taghi is not exactly a safe hobby. In 2018, a week after it became known that Nabil B. was cooperating with authorities, his brother was shot dead. The message was unmistakable, and in 2019, Nabil B.'s defense lawyer, a man named Dirk Wiersum, was shot and killed outside his own home in Amsterdam. In broad daylight, lawyers started refusing to take the case. The whole thing was collapsing from the outside pressure. Nabil B. was desperate, and then he reached out to Peter de Vries. De Vries agreed to come on board as a confidant and advisor to the Crown witness. Not as a lawyer, he wasn't one, but as a trusted figure, someone who could support Nabil B. through the trial process and make sure his story got out. It was a bold move, and de Vries knew the risks. In fact, authorities had already told him in 2019 that his name was on a hit list drawn up by Taghi's organization. He was warned, directly. He didn't back down. His motto, which he had tattooed on his leg, was, "On bended knee is no way to be free." That basically tells you everything you need to know about this man. On the evening of July 6th, 2021, de Vries appeared as a guest on RTL Boulevard, a popular Dutch entertainment and news program, a totally normal thing for him. He was on TV all the time. The show wrapped, he said his goodbyes, and he walked out of the studio onto the Lange Leidse Dwarsstraat, a busy street near Amsterdam's Leidseplein Square. He was walking to his car, and that's when it happened. A gunman approached him from behind and shot him in the head at close range. Multiple shots. On a public street, with people around, de Vries collapsed. Emergency services rushed him to the VU University Medical Center in critical condition. The entire country went into shock. The Dutch king called it an attack on journalism. The Prime Minister gave an emergency press conference. The mayor of Amsterdam called it a brutal, cowardly crime. 9 days later, on July 15th, 2021, Peter de Vries died from his injuries. He was 64 years old. Now here's where the digital side of this case becomes absolutely central. Police arrested 2 suspects within less than an hour of the shooting. A 21-year-old Dutch man identified as Delano G., suspected of pulling the trigger, and a Polish man named Kamil E., who was allegedly the getaway driver. They were caught on a highway near The Hague with the weapon still in the car. But who ordered the hit, and how was it coordinated? That's where the phones come in. Investigators found an encrypted phone in the getaway car belonging to one of the suspects, and on that phone were messages that prosecutors said laid out the entire operation. There was a photo of de Vries, taken that same evening inside the RTL Boulevard studio just before he walked out, sent from one operative to another. The message attached to that photo read, "You have to get this dog." Someone took a photo of this man while he was still inside the TV studio, sent it to the hit team waiting outside, and typed, "You have to get this dog." That's how calculated this was. That's how organized. This wasn't a random crime of passion. This was a coordinated assassination, executed in real time, using encrypted communications across a criminal network. And after the another message was sent from the getaway car. "He's dead." The bullet went right through his head. Everything spurted. Everybody screamed. That message was sent back to whoever had ordered the hit like a confirmation of a completed job. The investigation that followed was massive and sprawling. It took years. Eventually, in June 2024, 3 men were sentenced to prison terms of up to 28 years for the murder. 4 others received sentences for aiding and abetting. But the question of who exactly gave the final order, who sat at the top of the chain and said, "Kill Peter R. de Vries," took even longer to answer. It wasn't until March 2026, nearly 5 years after the murder, that Dutch authorities announced a breakthrough. A man named Ismail M., arrested in Morocco in October 2025 and identified as a key operative within Taghi's network, gave a statement naming Taghi's nephew, a man called Jawad F., as the person who ordered the attack. Jawad F. had been living in Morocco since 2018 and was already serving time there on separate charges The investigation is still ongoing. Now let's talk about EncroChat, because this is where the story gets genuinely wild. EncroChat was a commercial encrypted communications platform that launched around 2016. It sold modified smartphones. The cameras and microphones were removed, the GPS was disabled, and the only thing these phones could do was run EncroChat's own encrypted messaging app. They even had a panic wipe feature. If you pressed a button, the entire phone would erase itself in seconds. The company marketed itself as a privacy tool for legitimate businesses. But in reality, criminals loved it. By 2020, EncroChat had around 60,000 users worldwide, and European law enforcement estimated that the overwhelming majority of them were using it for serious organized crime, drug trafficking, arms dealing, murder for hire. It became the go-to communication platform for the continent's most dangerous criminal networks, including very much the macro mafia. Criminals felt completely untouchable on EncroChat. They talked openly. They planned openly. They ordered hits openly, because they were absolutely convinced that nobody could read their messages. They were wrong. In a classified operation that took years to execute, French law enforcement, working together with Dutch authorities and Europol, managed to hack into EncroChat's servers. In April 2020, they had successfully infiltrated the platform and were reading messages in real time. For months, without anyone knowing, law enforcement across Europe was sitting inside the private communications of tens of thousands of criminals. Think about what that means. Every drug deal, every shipment, every threat, every order, all of it flowing directly to investigators. When the operation went public in June 2020, the fallout was staggering. Over 800 arrests across Europe in the immediate aftermath. Hundreds of millions of euros in cash and drugs seized. Dozens of planned murders disrupted before they could happen. And for the macro mafia specifically, the EncroChat hack was devastating. Messages recovered from the platform painted a detailed picture of the organization's internal operations. Who was giving orders? Who was carrying them out? How money was moving? How hits were being coordinated? Dutch prosecutors used EncroChat evidence extensively in the massive Marengo trial, the sprawling case against Taghi and 16 other alleged members of his network. But here's where it gets even more personal. Taghi himself had fled to Dubai. For years, Dutch authorities knew roughly where he was, but couldn't touch him. He was allegedly running his entire criminal empire remotely, through encrypted messages, through intermediaries, through a digital web that kept him physically insulated from everything happening back in Europe. And then, in December 2019, Dubai authorities arrested him in a villa. He was extradited to the Netherlands, brought back in handcuffs, and placed in a maximum security prison. The most wanted man in the Netherlands, caught, partially because of the digital trail he'd left behind. The Marengo trial, named after a street in Amsterdam, became the largest criminal trial in Dutch history. 17 defendants. Dozens of charges including multiple murders, attempted murders, and drug trafficking on a massive scale. It took place in a specially built, high-security courthouse, essentially a bunker, because the threat of interference from criminal networks was considered very real. And during that trial, the EncroChat messages were front and center. Conversations in which members of Taghi's network allegedly discussed ordering murders. Conversations that placed specific people at specific crime scenes. A digital paper trail that, ironically, the criminals themselves had created, convinced it would never be seen. In February 2024, Ridwan Taghi was convicted of multiple murders and drug trafficking and sentenced to life in prison. The judge described his organization as responsible for a string of cold-blooded killings carried out with military precision. But even from behind bars, the reach of this network seemed to extend outward. In 2023, while awaiting his verdict, Taghi's own son and nephew were arrested on allegations that they were trying to help him escape from prison, smuggling in information, maintaining communications, attempting to keep the network alive, even with its leader locked up. And as we talked about in the previous case, the murders of Vries and lawyer Dirk Viersum, both connected to the Marengo trial, are still generating new arrests and new revelations. As recently as March 2026, a key suspect in the De Vries murder was named, connecting directly back to Taghi's inner circle. This thing is still unraveling. So what's the takeaway from the macro mafia case when it comes to the internet and digital crime? It's almost the flip side of what we saw with Coban and De Vries. With Coban, the internet was the weapon, the tool he used to destroy his victims. With De Vries, encrypted communications were the infrastructure that made a murder possible. But with the macro mafia and EncroChat, the digital trail that criminals thought made them invincible was ultimately what brought them down. 60,000 users, hundreds of criminal organizations, Millions of messages. All of it cracked open by a hack that criminals never saw coming. The very thing they trusted to protect them became the most detailed confession they ever gave. There's something almost poetic about that, in the darkest possible way. And that's it for the Netherlands. 3 cases. 3 completely different ways the internet intersected with crime. As a weapon, as a murder coordination tool, and as a criminal empire's fatal blind spot. If you want to see which country we're covering next, make sure you're subscribed. We're going deep on this series, and every country has brought something I genuinely didn't expect. See you in the next one.